Good afternoon. My name is Adrienne Payne-Andrews, and I'm the Project Director for the Healthy Communities Initiative. I'd like to welcome you to the Kansas Health Foundation's Healthy Communities Initiative webinar, Local Policy Options for Kansas Communities. For today's webinar, Public Health Law Center staff attorneys Mary Marrow and Natasha Frost will outline select local policies that help increase access to physical activity, opportunities, and healthier food options. The webinar will provide an overview of government authority to regulate the transportation system and the food environment. On the line with me today are Jeff Usher with Kansas Health Foundation, Natasha Frost and Mary Marrow with the Public Health Law Center, and in addition, Vicki James with Healthy Kids Challenge is on the line to help with some logistics and some announcements at the end. We will begin with the Public Health Law Center presentation and leave time at the end for questions and discussion. And following the presentation question discussion time with Public Health Law Center, Jeff Usher will facilitate additional discussion and networking opportunities. But before we begin, I have just a few housekeeping items. All of you have your lines muted. Please type in your questions throughout the presentation on the right side of your screen. Jeff will be keeping track of those and will make an announcement at the end. Jeff, at approximately, 12:45, Mary and Natasha will respond to those questions. If you've not keyed in your audio pin shown after joining the webinar, please do so, as that allows your line to be unmuted later for the networking call. The webinar is being recorded and will be archived on SharePoint within a week in the same location as the other webinars, and I will announce that at the end. For now, I will go ahead and turn it over to Jeff.
Thanks, Adrienne. I'm Jeff Usher, Senior Program Officer at the Kansas Health Foundation. I'm not from the Center for Community Support and Research, but many of you have already met Mary and/or Natasha, but this is going to be the first time we've been offering to expose the Public Health Law Center to all of our healthy communities in a webinar. Both Mary and Natasha are staff attorneys with the Public Health Law Center. They have a great deal of experience working with policy issues around active living and healthy eating, as well as tobacco prevention and tobacco control. And we have an agreement with them here at the Kansas Health Foundation to work with a number of initiatives around Kansas regarding healthy behaviors. But specifically right now, they're part of the technical assistance team to our healthy communities. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mary, who will start off first, and followed by Natasha.
Thanks so much, Jeff, and I'm sorry about getting your organization wrong. I don't know how we missed that. So anyway, thanks for correcting that. So I just want to thank everybody for joining us today. And as we're getting started, I just wanted to go over some brief training objectives for the webinar today, and just remind folks that that we are going to be working hand in hand with you over the coming months in supporting your efforts through the HCI efforts. And so there's going to be a lot of information that we're providing right now, and I just want to encourage you that if you have questions, please enter them into the webinar chat box. And also, if you have any things that you want to follow up with us on that we don't have a chance to get to today, we will have other opportunities to do that in the future. So for today's webinar, what we're going to be focusing on is looking at the local government structure in Kansas. And so looking at the local government decision-making process, the structure, discussing state and local regulatory environments that impact your active transportation and healthy food initiatives, and then also looking at some key policy opportunities to promote active transportation and access to healthy food. And we're really going to be focusing on the Kansas context. While I'm going over some of these preliminary areas, I just want for you to keep in mind some of these just basic questions that I think that communities are really grappling with right now in trying to identify what their policy areas are going to be. And we want to add some other layers to your conversation, which hopefully you'll walk away with these other ideas today. So, for example, who has the authority to do what in your community? What is the best area of focus for your community, and where is the best place to implement your policy initiative? Why are you choosing a specific policy area over another? What is your process? Who have you engaged with? And then, really importantly, how will this policy be implemented? One of the things that we're starting to hear from some communities that have been working on different healthy eating and active living initiatives, not just in Kansas, but also in Minnesota and in other communities, is just the challenge of once you get a policy in place, the implementation and really moving forward to make that policy alive and meaningful in your community. And some of that process should be part of the development of the policy and thinking about how it's going to move forward. So just keep these general concepts in mind as we're going through this information, and we'll continue discussing some of these concepts with you throughout our work together. So as we are getting started, we have a couple of the disclaimers that we have to provide, just to remind you that the legal information and assistance provided in this training does not constitute legal advice or legal representation. And then also, I just wanted to remind folks that there are limitations on lobbying as part of your HCI activities. And today we're going to be talking about local government authority and the decision-making process in local government and in local communities. And so it's important to keep in mind also the limitation on lobbying. And we just want to strongly encourage you to use the recent webinar with the Alliance for Justice that went into a lot of detail about lobbying, what is and isn't lobbying, and how to really evaluate what your approach should be in your communication with decision makers. And I believe that that webinar is available on SharePoint. So if you haven't had a chance to take a look at that webinar, we just encourage that you use that as a resource. So now let's get started. So what I'm going to start with is providing a broad overview of governmental authority in the United States, and then in Kansas, and at different levels of local government, because as you're looking at different active transportation and healthy eating initiatives, there are a lot of different players involved and different governmental entities that may have some authority or influence over the initiatives you're pursuing. So this is going to be really a broad overview. But first of all, let's just start at the biggest level and talk about the concept of federalism. And this is basically the relationship between the federal government and state governments. And active transportation and healthy eating may involve, in your policy efforts in those areas, may involve different levels of government. And so it's important to just keep in mind that there may be some pieces at play that are bigger even than your Kansas state context. And so broadly speaking, federalism involves the division of power between federal and state governments. And the key concept to keep in mind is that states reserve all the powers that the Constitution, or the federal Constitution, does not withhold from them. And the counterpart to that is that the federal government's power is restricted to the specific powers defined in the Constitution. So if you want, maybe this image will help you keep that in mind. So if you think about the image of a cake, the slice of the cake can be thought of as representing the defined powers given to the federal government, while the rest of the cake or power lies with the states. So then that moves us quickly to the state of Kansas. And so your state government has authority over many aspects of your local transportation and food systems. And your state government delegates and gives authority to your local governments. And so we're moving into local governments really quickly because that's what this the HCI initiative is really focused on. And but it's also important to remember how local governments fit within the context of both the state and the federal governments. So local governments in Kansas have a lot of authority over local affairs, a lot more authority than in some other states. And specifically, local governments have a lot of leverage and ability to around public health, safety, and welfare issues impacting local communities, so long as the local government action does not conflict with state or federal law. And I just got a very strange echo, so I don't know if other people are having a problem. Okay, anyway, it seems to have gone away. But if folks are having any audio problems, please put that into your chat box. All right, so now moving even further into the Kansas reality, Kansas local governments are also called municipal governments and can be any one of a broad range of governmental systems. I think the most common ones that you're probably aware of involve your counties, cities, and townships. However, Kansas state law also identifies other local governmental systems or units, and so it's important to keep in mind or be aware of the fact that there may be other local governmental units that could have a role in your healthy eating and active transportation initiatives. So for example, school districts are also recognized as a local governmental unit in some instances in Kansas state law. And this is something that the Public Health Law Center can help you uncover if you're working on, say, a specific transportation initiative or other area, just to make sure that you are aware of the different local governmental units that may have a say in a different initiative and should have a place at the table as you're talking about your efforts. So Kansas counties are play a really big role in the state governmental system, and it's important to understand the decision-making process that county governments have, who has the authority to make decisions, and what the county government can make decisions about. There's 105 counties in Kansas, and there's two main kinds of authority that county governments have. First of all, county governments act as agents of the state. They get their authority through the state, through state laws, and they work in concert with your state government. Then in addition, though, counties also work with other municipal and local governments and can support individual cities around economic development, comprehensive planning, zoning, environmental protection, and other areas of local concern. So county governments kind of are in the, I want to say middle management, but kind of in the middle between the state governments and local governments, and can really be an important player in navigating some of the local issues that you are going to be pursuing with your HCI efforts. Then we move to Kansas cities. And there are 626 cities in Kansas, and one of the things I think is important to keep in mind is that there are different decision-making structures in different Kansas cities. So, for example, there are these three main types of city government in Kansas. There's the mayor-council system, the commission system, and the commission-council-manager system. And I bring this up because I know that based on some of the calls that Natasha and I have participated in with HCI communities, your leadership teams have representatives from a wide range of different roles in your local communities and different local governmental systems. And so you may be working with people on your leadership team from different cities. And it's important to realize that even between different cities, there may be a different governmental system or decision-making process. And so you just want to just be aware that you may be talking apples and oranges sometimes, and to just be sensitive to how to some of those differences as you're working together. And then the other main area of local government in Kansas are the unincorporated townships, or generally called townships. And there's almost 1,400 Kansas townships, and they're also a really important piece of the puzzle. And Kansas townships also work closely with the county government system as well, sometimes I think even a little more so than the city governments do. So now thinking about the policies that local governments may be able to enact around healthy eating and active transportation, there's a number of different approaches that local governments can take to promote healthy eating and active transportation. This is a snapshot of some of the key ways that we've identified that local governments in Kansas can be involved in supporting your efforts. There may be others as well, but we think that this covers the main themes. And I think that when you're thinking about what specific policy initiative you want to focus on, it might be helpful for you to think about these different approaches and what best fits your local context and what your community needs are. And another thing that has really struck me in talking with different leadership teams that are part of the HCI efforts is just this real move towards collaboration between different local governmental entities and the efforts for you to come together and to really move forward to promote public health, healthy eating, active living throughout your community and state. And with the increasing complex responsibilities and shrinking resources that local governments are having these days, the need for cooperation among local governments is growing. And by creating full and harmonious working agreements with other interested local governmental units, you can accomplish a lot more through collaboration. Kansas cities and counties and other municipal governments have their authority to cooperate with other units of local government from state law and the Interlocal Cooperation Act. This act provides broad authority for intergovernmental cooperation. And there are other statutes in Kansas that provide specific areas of, or that address specific areas of cooperation between different local governmental units. I'm not going to go into those specifically, but it's just good to keep in mind that there is a process and from state law that directs local governments in how you can cooperate and work together on some of these initiatives. And I just wanted to highlight, I mean, there are, I'm sure, a lot of different opportunities for collaboration and different ways that local governments are working together. This Kansas collaboration is one that we identified that seems to really be promoting the work between local governments and helps to formalize some of the collaboration between local and state governments as well. So now that we've covered briefly just the governmental structure and some of the layers involved in your local governmental context that could impact your policy-making process, it's also important to think about what the decision-making process is in your local government. So who has the authority to make decisions? You know, going back to that slide, looking at the different kinds of city governments. Like, so what is your governmental decision-making structure? What areas does the local government have authority to make decisions about? And it's really important to think about some of these questions and make sure that you're clear about who's making the decisions and what you can make decisions about before you identify a policy area that might be outside the scope of what you can actually accomplish. Another thing I think that's important to keep in mind is this idea of transparency in governmental decision making. And so the Kansas Open Meeting Act is a really important piece of state legislation that requires transparency and openness in governmental decision making. It requires that their public be involved, that there aren't deals being made in back doors, you know, that there's just kind of some checks and balances, and that the public is involved in keeping their governmental officials accountable. And so when you're thinking about different governmental or different policies that you may want to pursue, it's just important to keep in mind this your local governmental context, the structure, and what the process is in making decisions for your community. So now I'm going to shift gears and talk more specifically about active transportation policy initiatives. And this is Kevin with CCSR, and he did want me to comment that he usually does wear a helmet, but this was one day he was just kind of playing around when actually the last time that I was in Kansas in April, and it was a fun photo. So anyway, we'll have Kevin set us off on the right track here to talk about active transportation policy initiatives. When thinking about your active transportation efforts, I think it's really helpful to think about the transportation system from a broad view, because as I've been finding through my work here in Minnesota around some of what we call the complete streets or active transportation initiatives, active transportation can come up in unexpected places in the transportation system. And so while I think a lot of times people are focused on, well, how do we manage sidewalks, or are there trail systems for bikers? You know, I'm finding things like, well, are shoulders actually available for use for bikers and pedestrians, and what kinds of crosswalks or intersection markings are there on roadways or highways to support active transportation. Those areas may not immediately, you might not immediately think of them as active transportation issues, but they really can be an important piece of the transportation system that supports active transportation. So this slide just shows a number of different aspects of the transportation system, some which include active transportation and some which don't. So for example, some portions of the transportation system are not available for active transportation, as in most states prohibit or restrict bicycles and pedestrians on interstate highways. Likewise, there are usually other highway or roadway designations in states that may have controlled access and may limit pedestrian and bike traffic. And so it's important when you're thinking about how you want to promote or provide facilities for active transportation that you know if a specific roadway or highway or area that you're focusing on is actually a viable option under state or local law. So active transportation means different things to different people. This just gives a snapshot of some different things that I've come across, and there may be others as different types of transportation becomes, there's different vehicles or transportation modes that may be coming up that you might see in Kansas that may include an active component. So when you're thinking about your active transportation initiative, I think it's also helpful to think about who benefits from active transportation, because there may be some stakeholders that you don't think of offhand that could be really useful to have at the table when you're identifying priorities or different, how to build public support for your active transportation initiative. So I know that here in Minnesota we found that the senior citizens and the AARP can be a really important partner to have with your active transportation efforts, and they can really, they can bring a lot of resources and other voices to the table that you might not think of. And I think it is important, because if you think about senior citizens' access to transportation and mobility issues, making sure that sidewalks are available, that you have curb ramps, things that that line up a lot with individuals with disabilities, and access by individuals with disabilities also can come up in the same way with senior citizens. So just think about different people in your community that may benefit from your active transportation policy, and engage with those individuals as well as you're identifying your policy and moving forward. In addition to the people who benefit directly from the active transportation, again, I want to go back to who is making decisions impacting your active transportation system. And there may be governmental entities involved that you don't think of immediately, like, what is the involvement of a school district in promoting, say, the transportation system around the school, or Safe Routes to School initiative. And this snapshot provides just an overview of different layers of governmental involvement in specifically road responsibility, and this is focused a lot on the transportation system. I just want to acknowledge that in addition to the transportation system, there's also the recreational and parks systems in Kansas, and there may be different governmental entities involved in that than in the transportation system. So you may have the park board or the wildlife agency, the state agency involved in some of the these recreational facilities. I forgot the name. It's the Department of Wildlife, Parks, and Tourism is a state agency that might be involved in some of the trail systems, the state trail systems in Kansas, where, say, the State Department of Transportation would be involved in some of the roadway systems. In addition, I just want to acknowledge that Native Americans also have their own separate transportation system on reservations, and tribal transportation authorities can also be an important partner in a comprehensive transportation system in your county or community. And so we found here in Minnesota that Native Americans have a real important voice and are important stakeholders to include, depending on how different active transportation initiatives may overlap with reservation boundaries or other areas of concern. And I know that with some calls that we've had with some HCI communities, some communities are engaging with American Indian tribal representatives in their communities around some of their initiatives. So I know that there are some conversations going on that include that stakeholder as well. And so I thought that this was a really nice snapshot or map of Dickinson County, showing an effort to identify who is responsible for different roads in the county. And this is a kind of tool that might be really useful for you if you're thinking about how you want to, if there's a trail system that you want to focus on and expand in your community, or different roads that you may intersect, say, with a recreational trail that you want to promote. It's important to understand who is responsible and really have a snapshot of that so that you make sure that you're talking to the right people as you move forward. So active transportation policy initiatives can include a wide range of different areas. And then going back to, we talked about this briefly before, but this is focused on different policy areas specific to active transportation. And this provides a snapshot of different active transportation policies that local communities might want to pursue, and some things that we've heard people talking about in our calls with the HCI communities. And one of the things that we're finding, and I think I mentioned this a little bit earlier when I first got started, is that even as you are identifying your policy area and coming up with your policy intervention, it is really important to think about how that policy is going to be implemented and sustained and made a living part of your community. And in a recent call, I think it was just a couple weeks ago, with the community interested in active transportation, they were talking about the idea of an active transportation committee charged with really evaluating the needs of their community, identifying gaps or areas where there were obstacles or challenges to active transportation, and using this active transportation committee as a resource to move a policy area forward. So I thought that that was a really interesting conversation because, as we found, even here in Minnesota, we found that even though we have, like, for example, we have a statewide complete streets law, but just because we have the law doesn't mean that it is implemented. And so you have to have some real action steps built into your policy and people responsible for following through with what the policy lays out. And an active transportation committee could be one way that you could do that, depending on what works in your area. Active transportation policies can focus on a number of different needs of the community, from safety, accessibility, ensuring that the planning, design, maintenance, and construction requirements for facilities meet the needs of different modes of transportation. And also, active transportation policies can help to provide some of the funding needed to ensure that you have the financial support to actually carry out your policy. There's a wide range of different facilities. I think that some people also may call them elements in your community that can support active transportation. This is a snapshot of different facilities or elements that have some legal definition in Kansas law, and so I just wanted to provide that so that you can see just what a range of different areas could be a focal point for your policy area, or you might actually have a broader policy initiative that incorporates a number of these different elements. And again, I want to point out that while a lot of these are focused on the transportation system, there are also the recreational trails and parks piece that can be an important component, helping to make connections between different components of your transportation system. So with that, I also wanted to highlight the city of Abilene passed I think it was a resolution to develop some bike and walking routes in the city, and this is a map of what they're currently working towards now, and I thought that was just a nice way of thinking about how one city has approached supporting active transportation through biking and walking in a really concrete way in their community. So when you're thinking about your active transportation initiatives, I think it's helpful to keep some key concepts in mind, including what aspect of the transportation or recreation system you can impact, what the policies and or strategies that you want to pursue are, what possible obstacles may come up, and what the tools that are available to you are that can help you navigate some of those obstacles or challenges. So with that, I am going to turn the webinar over to Natasha. I know that this was a really quick overview of local governments in Kansas and active transportation, but I'm hoping that this will help spur some additional conversations with you, and I do invite further conversations between the Public Health Law Center and questions that you may have that have come up throughout this presentation. Thanks, Mary. As Mary mentioned, we're going to go really quickly through some healthy food initiatives and the different state and local laws that affect that environment. And these are just very basic pieces of information to kind of get your creative juices flowing as you try and figure out which policy opportunities you're going to pursue. These are real flags for you. We're not going to go into a lot of depth, but I really think that the important piece is going to be to think about how this all relates to your efforts, and then as you have questions or really dig into that policy opportunity, to reach out to the Public Health Law Center, to Mary or myself, and we're here to help support your efforts. So onward to healthy food initiatives. So Mary and I have been on several calls with folks around the state of Kansas, and for you all who are focusing on the healthy food portion for your policy efforts, you've been talking about a lot of different things to really help promote healthy, affordable food access in your community. Some of you are thinking about food hubs, land banks, vending concessions. Others are thinking more about, farmers markets, community gardens, and grocery stores. And this is all part of this larger effort to provide healthy and affordable food access to community members. Now, one way to actually focus all of those efforts and try and figure out which one makes the most sense is to actually have an overarching food policy council. A food policy council, as you all know, serves as a way to discuss these food issues and fosters coordination between the different pieces of the food system. And it's really meant to help evaluate and influence policy. So a food policy council may take a look at local policies and identify things that need to happen at the local level to help promote healthy food access. For example, the Food Policy Council would be well positioned to identify problems with zoning that may affect local government or local community members and their ability to have a community garden or even a garden in their own home. And one of the ways that we wanted to focus on today, since we're talking about local government, the way to actually create a local government-appointed food policy council could be through a resolution or an ordinance. And we've identified the kind of three main components of that ordinance. It includes membership, so identifying who is a member of or should be a member of the Food Policy Council, what the goals of the Food Policy Council are, and then what the responsibilities are. And one key concept to keep in mind, folks, is that as you develop a comprehensive Food Policy Council, if you want that Food Policy Council to focus on healthy food access, that resolution or that ordinance really needs to state that. For example, in Nashville has a food policy council that's created by a local resolution, and
For example, they specifically list a nutritionist as part of their key membership of their 8 members. In addition, their #1 responsibility is to improve access to healthy foods and promote healthy eating. That's their #1 responsibility. Now compare that to other food policy councils. For example, Douglas County. Douglas County has more of an agricultural focus, and so it might not have healthy food access as the top priority for that particular food policy council. So it's really important as you develop these food policy councils that you think about the language of the ordinance or the resolution, because that is something that is going to really impact what that food policy council can look at. So as we're thinking about the food environment, we want to think about what state regulations are in place to try and figure out how all the pieces fit together. So there's lots of ways that the state of Kansas regulates or controls the local food environment. And one key way is by licensing and inspecting food establishments, including vending machines and other vending places. And then also they license and inspect food processing plants. So the Department of Agriculture has the duty of doing this, and they inspect and license these food establishments or food processing plants. The Department of Agriculture can also authorize a local government to enforce the act. So that means that a local government might have the power to license and regulate through the state through a state contract. And so it's really important to keep in mind that your local governments may actually be impacting the food service or licensing of food service establishments already based on that. So what is a food establishment? Well, a food establishment needs a license, and it's any place where food is prepared or served for sale or service. So it has there's a lot of different things that are considered a food establishment for purposes of licensing. It's things like mobile restaurants or coffee shops, cafeterias, nonprofit organizations that routinely serve food, convenience stores or grocery stores. Those sorts of facilities are all considered a food establishment and require a state license. Now there's two key exemptions from the licensing process. One is that vending machines that only dispense canned or bottled soft drinks, or prepackaged food that doesn't require temperature control for safety. So all of your, Little Debbie snack cakes and potato chips and that sort of thing, or nuts. If it doesn't require refrigeration, those do not require a state license. And it also, roadside markets that offer only whole fresh fruits, nuts, or vegetables for sale also do not require a state license. So in addition to food establishments, food processing plants are required to have a license. And the reason why you need to keep that in mind is a food processing plant is where it's a commercial operation that processes or stores food for human consumption. And it is often, this is sort of activity is often done by a food hub, and so those of you who are pursuing a food hub, you need to keep in mind that state licensing may play into that policy decision. So what about the local governments? In addition to maybe being an arm of the state, so to helping with the licensing and inspection of food establishments or food processing plants, local governments do a lot of things. They can put limits on businesses, and as long as they're tied to the safety and health of their community residents. They can do permitting, their own permitting for food establishments, so a separate permitting process that extends beyond what the state requirements are. And that with permitting, you can also have fees. But one key thing that local governments cannot do is they cannot impose any fee on a producer or of a farmer for their own products that they get from the farm. So if a farmer grows tomatoes and cucumbers and brings those in to sell, the local government cannot pose any sort of local fees on that food. So that's an important consideration as you think about policy opportunities at the local level, and there are many. So we're just highlighting a few of the ones that rose to the top. And the other thing that you need to keep in mind, in addition to kind of that local context, so the limits on the local government regulation, is also figuring out what you're talking about and what the environment is and what the legal environment is. So, for example, vending. Vending, a lot of you are thinking about affecting the vending environment. So vending machines, but what is vending? And the answer is it really depends on which law you're looking at. For example, there's a federal law and a state law called the Randolph-Shepard Act. So there's the federal Randolph-Shepard Act and then the state version of the Randolph-Shepard Act that has a very broad definition of vending. And that includes vending machines, but it also includes cafeterias and food stands. And so if you're thinking about affecting that environment, you're going to want to look to those two pieces of legislation to figure out what that definition is and what the rules and responsibilities are for local governments and what you can and cannot do. In addition, there's a federal menu labeling law. There's the Kansas Food Code, has a definition of vending and has responsibilities laid out in there. And then many local governments actually have vending vending ordinances that define what vending means. And so that's a key area that the Public Health Law Center can help you with, is if you decide to go forward with a vending or even any sort of nutritional standards incorporated within food establishment. It could be critical to kind of understand how those different laws overlap and intersect with your local policy efforts. So you should be pretty familiar with the way this looks, since this is the third time you've seen it today. But it does apply to the food environment as well. So there's lots of different policy opportunities. And you just have a lot of options when you're considering your different opportunities at the local level. So for example, you can have a farmer's market resolution, for example. Those sorts of things can have support for farmers markets in your community. There are also local government action where you can create a food policy council, as we discussed earlier. I also mentioned zoning for community gardens. Often zoning codes can either support or hinder local gardening efforts, and so the zoning the zoning ordinances for your community can be really important. School policies are really important as well, and so we've had a lot of work on farm-to-school policies that have been done throughout the country, and so that's a local policy you can pursue. We have a healthy grocery store ordinance. This is kind of a really exciting opportunity for folks around the country. Minneapolis actually has one, and that's where the city ordinance actually supports grocery stores that provide healthy food opportunities for community members. And then finally, many of you, as we've been hearing on the calls, are thinking about incorporating nutrition standards into vending contracts. So there's a lot of different opportunities for you to pick from, and there's a lot of different ways that you can work these concepts into local government policy change. But you need to keep in mind that even though you might have like your ideas about vending or farmers market, you need to keep your eyes open for local opportunities. I've been on a few calls and had some meetings where something rose to the top that was unexpected. For example, one community was really excited about pursuing vending. They thought this was a good opportunity to incorporate nutritional standards into the vending machines in their public health department at the local level, and then reached out to local Park and Rec and determined that the Park and Rec department was in the middle of negotiating its contract for a very large and a new construction of a recreational center. And so this was an opportunity that presented itself to that community, that HCI community, and there's a really amazing opportunity to affect change to thousands of youth who use that recreational facility. And so this also happened with another community where there's a school siting option available for them to help get in on the ground level. And so I just keep in mind that although you might pick a policy opportunity, to keep your ears to the ground on other opportunities that may present themselves in the coming months. So as Mary talked about, there are some key concepts to keep in mind about the food environment. You know, what sort of food environment do you want to impact? What are the various strategies that you could pursue, and what are those obstacles that might come into play, like feasibility or the likelihood of success politically? And then what tools are available to help? And so one of the biggest tools that's available that we'd like to highlight today is we're here to help. So that's Mary and I, for those of you who haven't met us yet. We'll be meeting you all in October. We are here to help you try and figure out what makes the most sense for your local context, and are happy to have phone calls and conversations with you as you try and make these just really important decisions on how you're going to spend your coming years related to the HCI grant initiative. And so I also wanted to take just a second to highlight some other help that's available from our office, and that's as part of the Tobacco Control Legal Consortium. I just met with a group a couple days ago, and they highlighted some efforts that they were doing that's not related to HCI, but they're tobacco control efforts. And I just wanted to share with you that we have a great team here at the center that helps coordinate tobacco control efforts across the country, and they are available for Kansas. They have technical assistance that they can provide to local governments and to local health departments and others who are pursuing tobacco control efforts. And so if you have any questions about that, obviously not part of HCI, but if you have any questions about what we can do to help you in that arena, please let Mary and I know, and you can contact us by email. And there is our email addresses, as well as visiting our website to see the various resources that we have available. And I should just throw it out there that we do have a lot of resources that we are kind of in the pipeline to develop specific for Kansas. And so as you have resource needs, you can let us know as well on how we can help in that arena. So with that, we'll go ahead and leave some time for questions. So I'll turn it back over to Jeff.
Hello. So if anybody has any questions, you can feel free to enter those into the chat box. I don't have any questions at this time, Natasha or Mary.
Okay. Well, I think if no one has any questions, I know that there's some time set aside after the presentation for the communities to share, and so I don't know if you wanted just to move into that.
Well, actually, we just had a question pop up.
Great.
And the question is, the policy changes you have presented seem big, like county level and road wide. Does any do anything? Are there any basically on a smaller scale?
Yes. Yes. I think the idea is that once you pick a targeted area, we can help kind of whittle down what's feasible. And we didn't include it in here, but in our past presentations, one of the things that we've helped communities do is talk about feasibility and kind of what makes the most sense for their local context. So for example, for healthy eating, entering nutrition standards into a vending contract can be really big because you can try and target a county commission for changing their vending standards for the entire county, or you can actually have it be on a much smaller scale by simply trying to get nutritional standards into one bid. For example, the Park and Rec example that I just gave, it's a citywide contract just for Parks and Recreation, and it's related only to one venue, potentially. And so that does have a smaller scale, and it's just a matter of figuring out what makes the most sense. So that's one example related to healthy food access that's very small scale, and I'll leave it to Mary to talk about active transportation on a smaller scale.
Yeah, and I appreciate that question, especially like with the active transportation piece, because the transportation system can be a really overwhelming system to try to navigate. And I think that providing that overview of the transportation system is important because sometimes I know that people aren't always aware of, oh, this is a state highway, this is a county highway, this is a local street. And so I think that just having that awareness of the bigger system is important. And at the same time, there are numerous ways that local governments can be involved on a smaller scale to help support active transportation efforts. So, for example, a policy initiative looking at crosswalks near schools, or maybe speed limits in certain areas where there are a lot of children, or if, maybe even like speed limits around local parks or things of that nature. I know that one community is thinking about working with to support a tax initiative for sidewalks because their community doesn't have the funding for sidewalks, and you know, so children and individuals can be safe walking. They need to have financial support for that. So, so I appreciate the question, and there are a lot of really specific and accessible local initiatives that I think you can pursue in both the healthy eating and active transportation areas.
And not all of them have to be resolutions or ordinances. I think the key thing is to think, what is, you know, the whole word policy, what that means is it's a written guidance for people's behavior. So sometimes there's local government policy that's guiding behavior that could be updated that isn't a resolution or an ordinance. For example, related to active transportation, simply figuring out which design standards the local planning folks are using and getting them to use a better design standard might not necessarily mean changing a local, you know, ordinance. It could just mean thinking about kind of how their internal structure works and looking to see which what their policy, so they're essentially a workplace policy, supports them doing. And so those are the sorts of things that kind of have a smaller scale. Just some examples.
We have a couple other questions. They just started rolling in. This is really related to the last one, but I'll ask it anyway. And it says, like, how about something like concessions at a park and rec system?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the goal is to figure out okay, talking about the food environment, what is your environment that you want to affect? And so if it's concessions at a park and rec facility, kind of working your way backwards and figuring out what sorts of policies are informing what food is served at those facilities. And usually what we found is that there are contracts in place with food vendors. And so looking to see when do the contracts expire, what sort of work can be done to try and change that food environment, such as getting nutritional standards to be worked into the next bid, working with whoever is in charge of that contract to see, you know, are there any policies in place that could be changed or updated or created so that future contracts and bids have the nutritional standards. That's a much bigger policy. You know, it depends on what sort of the scope and that, you know, how far up in the chain of policies that you want to go. So that's one example.
And I think that some communities also, like with this park and rec example, you know, like I know that there's some communities that have done some smaller scale initiatives, maybe say in an individual park system, and have had some success and then have moved on to another park system, and now we're looking at a broader, more county-wide healthy eating standard, for example. But I think that, I mean, this is where different communities that are part of the HCI initiative are at different places, and so different communities, what's appropriate in one community as compared to another may be very different based on where you are with your process. And so I think that one of the things that, you know, between now and October or September, whenever it is that you need to be identifying your policy area, is really figuring out what meets your local needs and making it as manageable as possible, even as you may be pushing the envelope a little bit.
Okay, we have a couple questions that are a little bit related, and I'm going to throw two questions that are related. Are there templates or examples of policies available or sample resolutions for starting a food policy council? And then can you address the politics of decision-making, tips for approaching policymakers to sponsor a food policy council? What do we need to think about? Staff support, budget, resources, etc.
Jeff, could you repeat that second question, please? There was just a lot in it.
Can you address the politics of decision making? I don't. So that's the first part. Tips for approaching policymakers to sponsor a food policy council. So basically, what do we need to think about? Staff support, budget, resources, etc.
Yep. There are templates available from around the country on making sure, especially just ensuring that healthy food access is incorporated into the language of a resolution. And I think, we'd be happy to share templates. But I have to say, we are hesitant to just hand off a template or a sample to folks without providing local context, because each local government works really differently, and the way that we fit in is what we'll do is we'll look at the templates and samples that we have. Then we look at what's going on the local level. So what do the resolutions look like? What do the ordinances look like? What sort of language is being used in those resolutions and ordinances? And then we tailor that sample language or that template language to fit that local community's needs. So the starting place is really locally specific. Because what we found is that, going to the second question, policymakers and community members who are deeply entrenched in their local community, when you bring them an example from somewhere else, another sample, maybe from California, Nashville, some other community, if it doesn't look like Kansas, if it doesn't look like the Kansas or even the local community's context, sometimes they're dismissed out of, without even a further glance. And so we found that really coming to folks with, and again, just a cautionary note about lobbying on this one, but when you try and figure out what fits within your local context, it's really important to reach out to the Public Health Law Center to try and help tailor those samples and those templates for you. In addition,
and at the same time, I can appreciate some of those samples can be really helpful to help you think about, well, how have other communities approached it? So yeah. I think that it can be really useful information. But again, like Natasha was saying, we just caution you to not just take it wholesale and think that it is going to just translate directly into your community. As to your question about the politics of the decision making, obviously there are many considerations that you're navigating in your local community, and this is where I think that the framework of the HCI initiative can be really helpful, that you have different technical assistance providers with different skill bases that can help you with that. And I think that CCSR has a lot of resources that can help navigate maybe some of those questions about the politics and navigating some of that local community context in a way that Natasha and I don't have as much of that to offer from the angle where we come from kind of this legal framework, although we definitely can provide support in identifying who the key decision makers are, what the legal requirements may be in a certain area, and who should be at the table.
Great. Another question we have is, what is the best way or route to research a particular policy change in our community? For example, if there is a particular policy we are looking into, where should we start in researching it in our community?
I hate to do this, but I feel like the answer is it depends. It really depends on the policy. For example, if, like using the healthy vending again, if you want to pursue healthy vending, you'd want to start figuring out what contracts are in place, which vendors are in place, who's in charge of the contracting process, is there a procurement department? And those are the sorts of questions that if you choose a policy opportunity, that is where you can reach out to the Public Health Law Center, and we can actually help get you started on the questions that are supposed to, the sort of environmental scan that you're supposed to complete as you're moving forward with that policy initiative.
Yeah. And the environmental scan, really doing that kind of comprehensive assessment is going to look different depending on what the policy area that you're focused on is. So, like if you're focused on healthy vending or concessions in your park and rec system, then an environmental scan of that system would be, and I'm making this up, but like where are all the different parks and recreational facilities in your county or city, whichever area you're focused on. And within each of those parks or recreational facilities, where are the specific food venues in that? How do these different food venues get their food? Like, is it through a contracting process? Do they have a vendor? Is it made on site? What kinds of, I mean, so that kind of really comprehensive snapshot of how you, of the policy area that you're considering. You know, and there would be a parallel with active transportation. So if you were looking at trying to create a comprehensive sidewalk system in your city, then doing an assessment of where are sidewalks, where are there problems, where are there gaps, and who is responsible for maintaining or funding different sidewalks, who the decision makers are, those kinds of considerations. So I do think that if you're narrowing in on a certain policy area, that then really doing an environmental scan of the different aspects of that policy area would be a great place to start.
Okay, we have one more question. If anybody has any others, go ahead and put those in the chat box. What is the best way to learn more about ways governments are working together?
Well, that is a great question. We actually have identified that resource in our webinar, and they actually highlight some of the ways that governments are working together on that website. And I think there is there's some different associations. I mean, that's something that we could, if you're interested in us doing some more research on that, we can definitely try and find out, dig into that question, and in particular, figure out if there's anyone in your community that's working together already, some existing relationships that are highlighted. So I think that's something that we'd be happy to do some more research on. Great question. All of them were great questions, just to make sure that that was clear.
Well, it seems like all the questions have been asked and answered, I hope to everyone's satisfaction. And it is a little after 1, so I think we'll go ahead and, unless anybody has some other questions, I think we'll go ahead and move into kind of our networking piece. So we'll stop the recording, and then we'll try to get everyone their ability to talk to us and ask questions. And of course, there's a lot of people that are on the line, so try to if you can mute your own phone until you have a question or a response that might be helpful, so we don't have 37 different people hearing different things. So